Qiang Jin Jiu. Book 3, Drunk in Wild Songs. Chapter 221, Quandary. Xiao Qi pulled open the bamboo blinds upon entering the room, and Fei Sheng took his leave. Bringing with him a trail of cool breeze from outside, Xiao Qi placed the opened letter on Shen Zequin's desk. In the second trial of the Dan City case, the Pan clan had an errant servant from their manor take the blame. They intend to extract Pan Lin out first on grounds of Pan Yi's lapse in management. Shen Zequin read the letter. The Pan clan misappropriated the commoners' fields, and it's now a scene of desolation everywhere in Dan City with 9 out of 10 houses standing empty. All they need to do is to check Dan City's census register and they will know that the displaced commoners left destitute and homeless last year numbered in the thousands. Just handing over an errant servant alone isn't enough to plug in the missing pieces. Pan Lin manages the 8 cities' taxes in the Ministry of Revenue. It's impossible for him to be unaware of how much is missing. The men in charge of the matters pertaining to the Pan clan's field taxes have already been thrown in prison. Xiao Qi blocked out some of the light. All these people insisted they were blinded by their own obsession for money and that they did not do so at the Pan clan's behest. Shen Zequin gently rubbed the paper with his fingertips. Pan Xiangjia, that wily old fox. Pan Xiangjia had seen firsthand just how formidable Hua Saiqian and Wei Huigo were, so he had long made preparations in order to take precautions against such a day. The men he arranged to be in charge of the Dan City's field taxes were all sons of his servants who shared a common interest with the Pan clan. Protecting Pan Lin at this juncture was akin to protecting the lives of their whole family, young and old. Naturally, they would be willing to keep their mouth sealed and take the blame. Xiao Qi said, since Xue Zaiozhuo dares to strike at this moment, he must have evidence that could be held against the Pan clan in his hand. He was even able to bring Kongqiu and Senyu on board, so it's not entirely out of the question for him to have the real account book of Dan City in his hands. Shen Zequin thought for a moment. But he didn't show his hand. This case already had the 3 judicial offices conducting a joint trial. Pan Lin had also been dismissed from his position pending prosecution. Xue Zaiozhuo only had to instruct Liang Qiushan to present the evidence as per procedure, and they would have emerged victorious. Even if only one Pan Lin was taken down in the end, it would also had a pivotal effect on the current division of power in Chu capital. I thought about it and the only thing that can hold Xue Zaiozhuo back from making a move is the spring plowing. Sunlight filtered out from behind and spilled onto the side of Lanzhou's face. Xiao Qi raised an arm to block it, refusing to let it peek. The spring plowing of the 13 cities of Juexi is right around the corner. But Juexi didn't suffer from a disaster last year, and the granaries of the 13 cities are in abundance. As if unaware of Erlang's possessiveness of him, Shen Zequin said, they didn't allocate military provisions to the 5 commanderies of Qidong in winter and merely replenished Chu capital's granaries, so they should still have reserves for spring plowing. What is Xue Zaiozhuo afraid of? There's naturally no issue to go by the original plan. Xiao Qi sat at the table's edge and looked at Shen Zequin. But what if something went awry in between? A hint was all Shen Zequin needed to make the connection. He set down the brush. Looks like the Empress Dowager wants to use Qizuyan's mobilization of troops to shift and empty out Juexi's granaries. The requisition of military provisions was what enabled Chu capital to empty out Juexi's granaries at this moment. If Xue Zaiozhuo acted arbitrarily now and insisted on continuing to dig deeper into the matter, then there was no way the spring plowing in Juexi this year could be carried out. The meals of tens of thousands of people were hanging over Xue Zaiozhuo's head, putting him in a situation where he had to beat a retreat even if he did not want to. What the Empress Dowager is doing here is getting the better of him by letting him strike first before launching a counterattack. Xiao Qi said. If Xue Zaiozhuo agrees to the requisition of military provisions, then the Juexi's granaries will be left empty. For the sake of the spring plowing, Juexi must borrow the grains from the 8 cities that still have reserves. In that case, Xue Xiaozuo can't offend the noble clans now. He has to cease pursuing the matter of the field taxes and make peace with the Empress Dowager, who represents the noble clans. If Xue Xiaozuo refuses the requisition of military provisions, there will be no one to replenish the military provisions of the 5 commanderies of Qidong, and Qi Ziyan will not be able to mobilize the troops. Juexi not only had to shoulder the load for Chu capital's granaries, but also Qidong's military provisions. If they lacked grains during the spring plowing season, the various prefectural prefects of the various areas would have to report the exact amount of grain shortage in the territories to the Provincial Administration Commission. As the Provincial Administration Commissioner of Juexi, Zhang Qingshan would have to think of ways to make up for these shortages. Under normal circumstances, the Ministry of Revenue would proceed to coordinate based on the harvest situation in the various local areas last year, and Zhang Qingshan would issue memorandums of debt to the provincial administration commissioners of the nearby regions that had bumper harvests last year to borrow grains. When the time came, everyone would make their own negotiations as to whether to exchange those grains with their own territory's agricultural products or with silver. However, at this time, only the 8 cities could loan out grains to Juexi. To convince the Empress Dowager to loan them grains after Juexi's granaries were emptied for the requisition of military provisions, Xue Xiaozuo had to drop his investigation into the field taxes of the 8 cities, including Dan City. Even if he has the money, he won't be able to buy grains. The whole thing about the field taxes has already alerted the perpetrators. If he missed his opportunity now, it would be even harder to investigate it in the future. Besides, this case has drawn the attention of the Imperial Academy. If Xue Xiaozuo were to beat a retreat, the students would denounce him in writing. Shenzhequan slowly leaned on the table. This trap that the Empress Dowager laid out is brilliant. She merely seized the opportunity to move around the weaker peaks, and she managed to put Xue Xiaozuo on the horns of a dilemma. The Empress Dowager also drew from Shenzhequan's influence here. The military provisions that Shenzhequan supplemented Qidong with were pilfered grains from Yanheru consolidated from the He province and Juexi's granaries. With the requisition from Chu capital, Juexi was no different from having undergone 2 rounds of military grain replenishment in just half a year. Of course its granaries would not be able to bear the burden. Xiao Qiye covered the top of Shenzhequan's head and said, "And so, Xue Yanqing, ever so meticulous and thorough in his strategies, found himself trapped in a deadlock. There is still a way out." Shenzhequan raised his eyes and said guilelessly to Xiao Qiye, "If I were in his shoes, I'd simply just take the Empress Dowager out of the game." Asterisk asterisk asterisk. With the snow in Chu capital melting fast in the past few days, water started trickling off the eaves along the streets. Fortunately, the public ditches had been newly repaired last year, so a repeat of the ditch blockage incident did not occur. The location of the Xue residence was not remote, but it was too close to the abode next to it, and the foot of the walls of both properties ended up so waterlogged that they collapsed. Xue Xiaozuo had been staying over in the Court of Judicial Review as of late. When he returned home to get a change of clothes, he saw that the courtyard wall had already been rebuilt anew, so he asked the steward in charge serving in residence, when was it repaired. Xue Xiaozuo did not bother with the unnecessary formalities in the management of his household. The steward, who was already getting up in the years, was still respectful and deferential as he followed at Xue Xiaozuo's side. He answered truthfully. "The eldest madam came back a few days ago to visit Jin Jiu. Seeing that the courtyard wall had collapsed, she brought up the matter to the eldest master on her return, and he called for someone to come over and repair it." Upon hearing those words, Xue Xiaozuo's eyes darkened slightly. He pondered it over for a moment, finding his eldest brother Xue Xiaoyi's actions unusual. Xue Xiaoyi did not get along with Xue Xiaozuo. He had squandered away his remaining family fortune after dividing up the family property to live apart. Benefiting from his relationship with Xue Xiaozuo, he held a sinecure position in the Ministry of Revenue, where he could barely make ends meet, so where in the world did he get this disposable money to help Xue Xiaozuo repair the courtyard wall? Get the accountant to reimburse him accordingly, Xue Xiaozuo said, and ensure that the eldest madam doesn't visit Jin Jiu again for no reason. Jin Jiu was the eldest legitimate son of Xue Xiaoyi. He was 8 years old this year. Xue Xiaozuo kept him by his side to raise him, and even when Xue Xiaoyi divided up the family property and left to live apart, Xue Xiaozuo did not return Jin Jiu to Xue Xiaoyi and his wife. The eldest Xue came to ask for him back several times, but as he always failed to see Xue Xiaozuo, he could only give up. The steward acknowledged his order with an "understood." Xue Xiaozuo's bundle was light. He never wore silk and satin, and his most ornate clothing was his official robe, so it was quite convenient for him to pack them up. He often stayed over in the office compound, with only a mute lad following by his side to prepare the ink for him. He had no maidservants and usually ate plain, simple fares. These were all habits he had retained from working hands-on at the local levels as chief supervising secretary of the Ministry of Revenue. Xue Xiaozuo had to return to the office compound once he was done packing. The steward held up the umbrella for him and gently advised him, "Third master always stays over at the compound without anyone to serve you. This weather is given to such sudden changes that you still need to put on thick clothes." When Xue Xiaozuo reached the entrance, the mute lad stepped forth to take over the umbrella and spoke to him, making sounds. Xue Xiaozuo nodded to indicate his acknowledgement and turned back to the steward. "I'll leave all household affairs in your hand. My monthly salary will be sent back on time. See if there's anything we can acquire for the residence, and you can just go ahead and buy it." Ever since Xue Xiaozuo was promoted, he never took the sedan again. Instead, he walked to and fro on foot. Now that he was done giving his instruction, he turned around to walk into the drizzle, with the mute lad holding up the umbrella. When he arrived at the office compound, he saw Yang Qiushan, who had already been waiting for a while. "Your Excellency Yanking." Liang Qiushan descended the steps to meet and pay his respects to Xue Xiaozuo. Xue Xiaozuo dismissed the mute lad and said to Liang Qiushan, "We'll talk inside." Liang Qiushan slowed down a few steps and followed Xue Xiaozuo into the house. It was lit inside, but the charcoal brazier was empty. Liang Qiushan found the chair cold when he took his seat. While waiting earlier, he had taken a look at this house. It was simple and unpretentious, and the only thing of worth here was the deceased old master Yao's writings hanging on the wall. Other than that, the table, chairs, and benches were all standard furniture. Who would have expected Xue Xiaozuo to be capable of shouldering the Kedong's military salaries? "Chang Shen, there's no need to hold back." Xue Xiaozuo opened a window and sat down. He spoke in a mild tone, "You're here today regarding the Dan City field tax case, right?" Xue Xiaozuo's stature was tall, and with his demeanor and poise, being around him made one feel as if they were standing amidst the spring breeze. He was now a significant official in Chu capital, but Liang Qiushan felt very comfortable in his presence. He not only lacked the haughtiness of a noble family's descendant, but also did not have the reservations of an official of humble origins. Moreover, he had the tendency to impress upon the others a favorable impression when he spoke frankly and in measured tones. "That's right." Liang Qiushan took out a securely wrapped account book in his arms. "This humble subordinate is here precisely because of the Dan City's field taxes case." Xue Xiaozuo waited for his next words. Liang Qiushan continued, "The Empress Dowager issued a decree last time for the third young Miss Hua to return for a visit. Commander-in-Chief Qi will have to accompany her in her father's stead. In my humble opinion, she meant to hurry His Excellency. There's no doubt that the Empress Dowager called for Qi Zuyan to enter the capital at this time to put pressure on Xue Xiaozuo. The requisition of military provisions was still stuck in limbo, and time waited for no man." Xue Xiaozuo said, "The Grand Secretariat has already drawn up the memorial to allow Commander-in-Chief Qi to mobilize troops against the Qingsha tribe, but the Empress Dowager kept putting off the approval. It is not entirely a bad thing for Commander-in-Chief Qi to enter the capital at this time. Liang Qiushan replied, but the requisition of military provisions is still up in the air. If this drags on, I fear it will delay Juexi's spring plowing. The dilemma here was the reason Xue Xiaozuo had not rested for days. He and Zhang Qingshan went to great lengths to straighten out the account books of the 13 cities of Juexi so as to prevent Juexi from falling into the displacement problem that was plaguing the 8 cities. The Empress Dowager held his weakness in her hands. This was not a move that he could afford to make rashly. Even if Liang Qiushan did not come to see Xue Xiaozuo today, Xue Xiaozuo would still have to go and meet him. He said, Changshen, you are in charge of all affairs pertaining to salt taxes in He Province and Juexi. Why don't you tell me the details of He Province? This implied an intention to borrow grains from He Province. Liang Qiushan looked hesitant. This humble subordinate shall be direct. It will prove difficult for your excellency to borrow grains from He Province. While it's true that He Province had an excess harvest this year, the public grains are being supplied to Chu capital, and the remaining grains will also have to be kept in reserve for the spring plowing. We can only borrow from the Yan clan. That Yan Hiru is a tough one to deal with, and he's also overbearing because of his wealth. He may not necessarily be willing to loan the grains even if we give him money. My fear is that he will take the opportunity to demand something else and end up being the fly in the ointment that ruins the entire game in He Province. Xue Xiaozuo contemplated it over. His struggle right now was over grains and not money, and the crux was that he has nowhere to purchase grain even if he had the money. Had it been Qidong's military salaries he was fretting over at present, he could still raise the tariffs in He Province and Juexi and fleece the merchants for the sum of money. But it just had to be grains that they were lacking. Hai Lianji's plans had been to transfer Zhang Qingshan over to restore Zongbo. By doing so, they would be able to round up some grains this year and put together more from Huai Province when the time came. Resolving their predicament over the military provisions was not hard. However, Zongbo was now Shenzequan's territory, and the commercial route between Tse Province, Huai Province, and Cha Province had cut off a relatively large portion of Chu capital's grain supply. When Commander-in-Chief Qi enters the capital, Xue Xiaozuo said, I'll discuss it with her. End chapter. Qiang Jin Jiu. Book 3, Drunk in Wild Songs. Chapter 222, Bluff of a Move. Horse hooves stirred up the mud and came to a stop at the entrance of the city gates. With a cloak hung over her arm, Qi Zuyan looked at the towering city walls of Chu capital with her back to the overcast sky. Day had yet to break at this time, and the young general of the 8 Great Training Division stationed at the top of the city wall instantly drew out his voice in a shout, "Open the gate! Our respectful welcome to Commander-in-Chief Qi." A few city soldiers shouted in unison as they pulled the gate open. The mechanism issued a muffled noise and the mottled city gate slowly rose. The 8 Great Training Division soldiers in the city stood solemnly on both sides, their faces to Qi Zuyan at the entrance as they held down their swords in greeting. Qi Zuyan raised an arm, and the Qidong cavalrymen behind her stepped back in unison, leaving a considerable distance between them. She shook the reins and led Hua Xianji's horse carriage onto the public road of Chu capital. The soldiers on both sides stood with solemn respect, their eyes never once wandering. Qi Zuyan was wearing court attire today. Although she was not conferred a noble rank and title, the Empress Dowager's personal appointment of her gave her the right to wear the court attire of a marquis. The court attire had a scarlet base, with a baize representing the transcend of ranks embroidered on the Mandarin square. She had also swapped out the Liangguan headgear that went with the male attire into a wuzu ornament that swung in the air along with the horse's movements. Court officials who were there to welcome them waited right ahead of the public road, while the Jin Yue Commander-in-Chief, Han Cheng, and Palace Eunuch, Fu Man, stood at the side. Both sides exchanged pleasantries before they had to lead Qi Zuyan into the palace. The streets had been cleared out, and no one made a ruckus. Chu capital was so silent that all that could be heard was the melodious chirps of a lone sparrow. Han Cheng mounted his horse and followed at Qi Ziyuan's side. With a smile, he said, Commander-in-Chief Qi has performed a valuable service now that the Bianjun Commandery has scored a victory. There's bound to be tremendous rewards on your entry into the capital this time. Although these words were spoken genially, they hit Qi Ziyuan's sore point. She had never been conferred a title despite having rendered meritorious service several times. Now that Libai had revolted, Qi Ziyuan and the Kedong's garrison troops standing rose as they became the Empress Dowager's support on the outside. Qi Ziyuan seized the opportunity to remove the eunuch serving as army inspecting censor and subsequently became the thorn in the southeast that could threaten Chu capital into making concessions. She had long incurred the displeasure of the Empress Dowager. Then, there was the war with Bianxia. The noble rank and title was the Empress Dowager's chain that held Qi Ziyuan in check, so there was no hope of conferment in the foreseeable future. Qi Ziyuan did not get along with Han Cheng and their previous encounters had all been unpleasant. Feigning cordiality with Han Cheng now, she said, I hope it would be as you say. Both of them socialized while on horseback. When they arrived at the palace gates, Fu Man, who had been following them the entire way from behind, hurriedly rolled off his horse and personally came over to take over Qi Ziyuan's reins. The Eastern Depot fell into decline after the death of Emperor Tianchen, and the 24 Yamen no longer had a eunuch of significance like Pan Rugui who had the world at his command. Thus, Fu Man behaved himself and kept a low profile. Qi Ziyuan did not have a good opinion of the palace eunuchs. Shuangshi, whom the imperial court had assigned to them as army inspecting censor, was still locked up in a cell in the Qiang Commandery. In order not to incur Qi Ziyuan's ill will, Fu Man had gone to the special effort of dressing up. Only daring to go for simplicity, he wore a gourd-patterned mandarin square, a coral duojin on his head with a cover on the outside, and a pair of black boots on his feet. Fu Man bent at the waist to take the reins from Qi Ziyuan and was all smiles as he said, This is our great Zhou's warhorse. This humble slave gives his assurance that he will feed it well on behalf of Commander-in-Chief Qi. Qi Ziyuan nodded and cast a look back at the horse carriage. She stood in front and waited for Huazianji. Han Cheng tossed his reins to the eunuch at the side and snorted when he heard Fu Man. Pointing at Fu Man, he said with a laugh, You sneaky old crook, kissing up to Commander-in-Chief Qi seeing how she's about to be rewarded. Understanding Han Cheng's character, Fu Man immediately said, Commander Han, you're making this humble slave felt shamed. He lowered himself and grew closer to flatter Han Cheng. This humble slave usually depends on Commander Han. Say, when will you be able to fulfill this humble slave's wish? You're the same age as me and you call me grandpa, Han Cheng said. Even I'd feel so embarrassed if this were to get out. Fuck you. Fu Man cussed him inwardly. This motherfucker kept putting on air all day, saying he'd feel embarrassed but doesn't he still treat others like wrenched bastards when bossing them around? But heaven has eyes and made him sunless, there's divine justice after all. How very gratifying. Fu Man soothed his chest and said with a merry laugh, when the forefather was still around, this humble slave was the son. So won't I need to address you as grandpa going by seniority? Han Cheng despised these buffoons who served as eunuchs but he was more than happy to boss them around like dogs. After the reign of Yanji, the eunuchs were all forefathers. Back then, when Pan Rugui led the Eastern Depot to oppress the Jinyue, Han Cheng was not yet its commander and it had filled him with envy to see Ji Lei acknowledge Pan Rugui as his godfather. Now that the tables had turned, he was naturally gratified to watch Fu Man bowing and groveling before him. Having attended the eunuch school, Fu Man was literate. During Emperor Tianquan's time, he joined forces with Xiao Qiye to work from both inside and outside and managed to get into the Directorate of Ceremonial. Later on, when Emperor Tianchen was assassinated by Muro, he instantly switched sides. Under Han Cheng's orders, he summoned Xiao Qiye into the palace with an imperial edict and consequently, Han Cheng framed Xiao Qiye for regicide. With this credit under his belt, Han Cheng was willing to continue letting him manage the important affairs of the inner palace. Feng Quan had stepped down from the stage now anyway. Fu Man just had to rack up some experience and build up his record of service, and he could be a forefather, too. Seeing that Hua Xianji had yet to get off her carriage, Han Cheng asked Fu Man as if in passing, "How has the heir apparent been lately?" Han Cheng made a bad move in the imperial prison back then and failed to kill Li Jianting. As a result, his own attempt to install a Han clan's descendant to ascend to the throne failed to come to fruition, and he made an enemy out of Xue Zaiozhuo. Thus, he specifically arranged for Fu Man to keep an eye on every single move that the heir apparent made in the palace. Turning his body sideways as a cover, Fu Man answered in a hushed tone. "It's all as usual. Xue Yanking's recent investigation of the Dan city's field taxes has thrown the imperial court into chaos." Han Cheng looked at Fu Man. "The Empress Dowager has been grieving over it day and night, and she's now in ill health. See if you can drop a hint to the heir apparent to get Xue Yanking to back down a notch." Fu Man was momentarily taken aback before he lowered his head in acknowledgement. The key point in this sentence was to make Xue Zaiozhuo back down a notch. As for how, that was for Fu Man to figure out. Li Jianting was no longer young, yet the Empress Dowager still showed no intent to return power to the heir apparent. She sat in place of the Son of Heaven, acting on his behalf and banishing Li Jianting outside the imperial court. Li Jianting's right to sit in on the proceedings was all at the suggestion of the officials participating in the classics colloquium. And now Xue Zaiozhuo was pushing them into such a corner in the outer court. The Empress Dowager meant to teach Xue Zaiozhuo a lesson. Fu Man's heart pounded, but he dared not let his expression betray his emotion and remained bowing until Han Cheng left. ******. Water dripped off the eaves, turning the window sills damp again, while the old books on the table started to crease. Yao Wenyu drew up his wide sleeves and flipped the pages open to dry. In the third month, when the ice and snow melted, Duan province suddenly turned warm and it was damp all around. Shenzhequan stood beside the table and casually looked at those old books of Yao Wenyu. Xue Yanking has to have a detailed discussion with Commander-in-Chief Qi regarding the requisition of the military provisions. Yao Wenyu smoothed the creased corners with the pads of his fingers. Only the Bianjun commandery of Qidong fought a war last year, and the military provisions at that time were supplied by Chu capital. The remaining 4 commanderies' garrison troops that also worked on the field suffered no loss either. Xue Yanking keeps a book of accounts in his mind. He will not fall for the Empress Dowager's trap easily. It's easy to stump him. Shenzhequan did not raise his eyes, looking as if he was pondering over the content in the book. The specifics of Qidong's harvest have yet to be reported. If Commander-in-Chief Qi insists that it's insufficient for their use, he won't be able to force it either. The longer Yao Wenyu stayed by Shenzhequan's side, the easier he found it to distinguish between the prefectural lord's moods. Like how Shenzhequan was clearly jesting now. This kind of shameless denial could not fool Xue Zaiozhuo, who was proficient in the art of auditing accounts. Yao Wenyu was in no hurry. Instead, he asked, "In your lordship's opinion, what bargaining chip should Xue Yanking use in his discussion with Commander-in-Chief Qi?" "Naturally, his biggest trump card," Shenzhequan said without hesitation. "He has the heir apparent in his hand, so on certain occasions, he has more of a leg to stand on than the Empress Dowager. Chu capital is a stickler for ethics and virtues. Even if the Empress Dowager is effective in her administration of the state, she's merely a stand-in for the Son of Heaven and is not the real Son of Heaven. The Empress Dowager was dependent on Qidong, but she married Hua Xianji over, then suppressed Qi Zuyan by refusing to promote her. At the same time, to ingratiate herself with Qi Zuyan, she treated Qi Zuyan with magnanimity to the extent that she could. Qi Zuyan turned a blind eye to Chu capital's deployment order during Shuangshi's and Lu Pinjian's incidents last year, and the Empress Dowager tolerated it all the same without calling her to task. This was to maintain the status quo of both parties. She kept Qidong pinned down under her own control at all times, so that Qi Zuyan would remain at her own disposal and, at the same time, unable to fall out with her since she would be handicapped by her lack of a noble rank. But Li Jianting did not have this misgiving. She was Great Zhou's rightful heir apparent, with the Grand Secretariat guiding her on the inside and her prestige as a student to bolster her on the outside. She also had the full support of the proactive faction helmed by Xue Xiaozuo. It was perfectly justified for Qi Zuyan to pledge loyalty to her. As long as Li Jianting could hold up against the censor's impeachments, conferring a title upon Qi Zuyan was just a matter of words. And this happened to be something the Empress Dowager could not do given the awkward position she was in. Shenzequan closed the page. Qidong's military power remains unstable for each day Commander-in-Chief Qi I isn't conferred a title. Being without a noble rank and title is the root source of Qi Zuyan's inability to legitimate her position. Imagine if she were to die on the battlefield or resign due to injuries suffered. Any of her illegitimate brothers would be able to grab the opportunity to seize Qi Xiu's title. The commander-in-chief of the 5 commanderies armies sounds impressive, but without a noble rank, she's merely a temporary holder of that position who could not inherit everything that Qi Xiu had. The Empress Dowager fears that Qidong would become a second Libe, so she dares not bestow a noble rank upon her, and what she dares not to do is the Empress Dowager's greatest weakness. What did Li Jianting lack the most now? Military power. The noble clans lost Wei Huiguo, and then they found themselves at a disadvantage with Hai Lianji's remonstration to his death. The Empress Dowager could still stand on an equal footing with the Grand Secretariat and Xue Xiaozuo in this game because she held Great Zhou's remaining 2 major military powers firmly in her grasp. Whether it was Kongqiu or Xue Xiaozuo, they were all civil officials who only had the authority to engage in military discussions but not deploy troops. If Xue Xiaozuo gave Qi Zuyan the promise to confer the rank and title of a marquis on her at this moment, then Qi Zuyan could give up going around in circles with the Empress Dowager and switch camp to the heir apparent. The Qidong military forces would then naturally pledge allegiance to Li Jianting, and this would be akin to hacking off an arm of the Empress Dowager. Money makes the mare go. Yao Wenyu took the book Shenzequan returned to him. If Xue Yanqing didn't have the Shi clan's money vaults, then he would not be able to convince Commander-in-Chief Qi with just a verbal promise. But now that he is bearing the expenses for Qidong's military salaries, Commander-in-Chief Qi would have to deliberate over it carefully. The above hypotheses were based on the premise that the Qidong's garrison troops who also worked the fields were truly able to be self-sufficient and did not need to forcibly requisition grains from the Juexi's granaries. However, Qidong's military provisions this year were, in fact, in Shenzequan's hands. Qi Zuyan had to take Zongbo into account, and she had to weigh it over carefully. If Shenzequan became displeased with her decision to switch sides to the heir apparent, then the Yan clan could sever the supply of Qidong's military provisions and Qi Zuyan would still need to ask Chu capital for grains. Xue Xiaozuo would be back to square one, where he would have to face his initial dilemma all over again. Xue Xiaozuo. Hua Hui, Shenzequan smiled as he tossed Yao Wenyu's spent brush into the brush holder. Who should I play with? Shenzequan's wrist bone bathed under the sunlight. He held in his hand an invisible thread, one that could steer the situation in Chu capital without so much as a sound. Yao Wenyu straightened the brush and said with certainty, "Your lordship already has a plan." Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Day had yet to break. Palace maids stood waiting in attendance under the palace eaves, keeping out of the way while silently carrying lanterns in hands to illuminate the path. Qi Zuyan entered the palace for her audience with the Empress Dowager. She had to head for Mingli Hall, while Hua Xianji had to wait in the Empress Dowager's bedchamber, so both of them could only walk together for a brief distance. As Hua Xianji could not stand the cold, she wore a Wutufur hat on her forehead as well. She had such excellent deportment that not even the tinkling of her jade ring pendant could be heard when she walked, and when she stood beside Qi Zuyan, she was only a little shorter. Qi Zuyan had been spending all day in the Bianjun commandery back in Qidong, and to date, She had barely spoken more than a few words to Hua Xianji. Finding it a little stifling, she was just about to speak when Hua Xianji asked, "Has Commander-in-Chief Qi taken a look at the household accounts?" It was then that Qi Zuyan remembered. "I looked through it when I returned home the last time." "Thank you." She got stuck on the word stepmother for a long time, truly unable to voice it out as she looked at Hua Xianji's face that was 2 years younger than her. All she could do was to hastily skip it over and continue, for going through the trouble. Hua Xianji covered the hand warmer and watched the crow flitting across the dark, gloomy sky. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared among the palace eaves. This was a sight familiar to her. She responded, "You're welcome, Commander-in-Chief." Qi Zuyan glanced out of the corner of her eye at the stalk of a small sunflower embroidered on Hua Xianji's collar. It was like a kind of delicate charm hiding under a dignified veneer, and it was completely out of place in the deep, silent inner palace. For that reason, it appeared particularly exquisite and lovable. All of a sudden, Hua Xianji turned her head and looked at Qi Zuyan for just a brief moment before she averted her gaze. Softly, she said, "The reasons my aunt summoned Commander-in-Chief Qi is, firstly, for the mobilization of troops against the Qingsha tribe and, secondly, for the requisition of military provisions. Both of these matters can be consolidated into one. Commander-in-Chief Qi needs to make a decision." Qi Zuyan could not figure out Hua Xianji's intent in telling her these right now. Her entry into the capital this time was being used by the Empress Dowager as a weapon to coerce Xue Xiaozuo and the Grand Secretariat. Qi Zuyan had long heard about the issues with Dan City's field taxes. However, Hua Xianji changed the topic and said, "Chu capital is full of storm all year around. Even if one were to stand at the top of the building, one still can't get a clear look at the splendor before it stares. What's more, the weather is so cold. Many stores on Jinwu Street have closed, and those who drink themselves drunk at night are those with empty stomachs." Slightly stunned, Qi Zuyan looked at Hua Xianji, who had already stopped in her tracks. The latter turned sideways to the silent Fu Man behind them and said with a smile, like neutered tomcats. Fu Man's mind was in a whirl himself. He vaguely heard the word cold weather and so he wasn't really registering what was being said. He saw Hua Xianji standing all daintily ahead of him and felt that the third young Miss Hua was beauty that was too peerless to be gazed at up close, so he lifted the lantern and said with an apologetic smile, "This humble slave was afraid of putting a damper on your ladyship and Commander-in-Chief Qi's mood and so did not dare to make a din. Since we're already here," Hua Xianji said to Qi Zuyan softly, "Commander-in-Chief Qi may go on ahead." ******. Thin frost hung over the newly planted flowers and plants at the side of the stairs to Mingli Hall. The front of the hall was wide and spacious, with the floors so polished they gleamed. Her name was announced from the inside of the waiting hall and a eunuch led Qi Zuyan up the stairs. She felt the chill under her feet as she stepped up those stairs. This was a sensation she could not get used to no matter how many times she had gone through it. The curtain in the hall opened to both sides, and Qi Zuyan strode in. The various court officials waiting inside rose to their feet. Qi Zuyan looked at no one in particular as she paid her respects to the Empress Dowager. Without letting down the beaded curtains, the Empress Dowager said with a smile, "I have not seen Zuyan for only 2 months, and already I miss her. It's bitterly cold over in the Bianjun Commandery. Rise, and let me have a closer look." Qi Zuyan raised her head. In the periphery of her vision, she saw the heir apparent standing at the side. The Minister of War, Chen Zhen, stood with his sleeves brought together and looked at Qi Zuyan with somewhat worried eyes. Sen Yu did not look too good either. Only Kong Qiu could be considered to be his usual self. The atmosphere in this hall was odd, just like those newly planted flowers outside which looked to be joined at the stems but were, in fact, merely a show on the surface, for its roots had long been damaged by the freezing cold. The Empress Dowager was confident of victory and was in no hurry to cut to the chase. After exchanging pleasantries with Qi Ziyan for a while, she said, "You are stationed at the frontier all year round, rain or shine. I heard you even refuse a maidservant. Even the most robust of health can't withstand such torment without someone to attend to your needs." Without waiting for Qi Ziyan to answer, she said to the Marquis of Helion with a sideways glance, "Just look at her." The Marquis of Helion met the Empress Dowager's eyes and lamented, "Seeing Commander-in-Chief Qi reminds this humble subject of that good-for-nothing son of mine, Fei Shi. He may be born a man, but he has no ambitions to speak of. This truly worries me. Fei Shi has only just come of age. There has to be someone at his side to supervise and guide him, or even a good-natured child will go wayward." The Empress Dowager looked at Qi Ziyan again. "Ziyan, do you still remember your Fei Didi?" Qi Ziyan answered, vaguely. "He's Zayu's younger brother." She seemed to be used to being forthright as she answered offhandedly. But even the commandery Princess Zayu had to address her as Jija. By doing this, she was pulling apart the gap in seniority between her and Fei Shi. But the Empress Dowager said, "Fei Shi is young, and the lack of people to teach him is worrisome. You are the commander-in-chief of the Qidong military forces, and he admires you very much. He keeps talking about Qijija all day long and is only dying to run over to Qidong. You are on good terms with Zayu, and both of your families aren't strangers to one another. If you have the time these days, share with him anecdotes from the frontiers to satisfy that fascination of his." Fei Shi was already of age, so what was there that he couldn't do and needed for Qi Ziyan to teach him? Furthermore, Fei Shi was just an heir apparent who had yet to inherit the Marquis of Helion's noble rank and title, and he had no official post either. He was so way down at the bottom of the rung compared to Qi Ziyan that calling her Jija was simply messing around. The Empress Dowager's intent was clear. She intended to appoint Fei Shi in marriage to Qi Ziyan in order to hold her down. For the sake of the military salaries, Qi Ziyan could not fall out with the Empress Dowager either. She said, "Given that it's your Majesty's instruction, I ought not to decline, but I did indeed enter the capital this time for military affairs. The issues at the frontier are of utmost urgency. It's inadvisable to delay any further." The Empress Dowager sat back slightly and did not put her further into a spot. Instead, she rolled with it and said, "Of course. The military report last month gave an account of the Qingsha tribe's invasion. You won the battle. You deserve a reward." Qi Ziyan had a clear handle on the filthy side of Chu capital. By stuffing Fei Shi to her at this juncture, the Empress Dowager meant to remind her to behave at the same time she dealt a blow to Shueziaozuo. The issue of the military provisions was a knotty issue, that is, if she did not have Shenzhequan's supply. Qi Ziyan abruptly recalled those words Hua Xianji had spoken earlier. Chu capital is full of storm. What was Hua Xianji hinting at her? "I've already taken a look at the memorial you submitted to the Ministry of War. It is not wrong to press home the attack and strike while the iron is hot, but it's not the right time now." Unable to get Qi Ziyan to compromise, the Empress Dowager continued, "The third month happens to coincide with the spring plowing. If Qidong wishes to go to war, the fields that the military garrisons work on will have to be left idle, and that means the supply of grains is bound to see a reduction after autumn. The shortfall will have to be obtained from other granaries, but it's no longer possible to make up for it, as the common folks of Juexi have to eat, too. The imperial court has its own difficulties. Engaging in aggressive militarism is never a wise policy. The ones to suffer will still be the common people." The Empress Dowager did not mention the granaries of the 8 cities, which meant that she was leaving it to Qi Ziyan to bring it up on her own. Qi Ziyan only had to broach the subject, and the problem could be kicked over into Shueziaozuo's court. Everyone would be caught in a deadlock when the time came, which meant that they still had to heed the Empress Dowager's arrangements. If Shueziaozuo did not drop the case and Qi Ziyan would not marry, then Qidong would neither be able to deploy its troops nor receive grains. The sudden silence in the hall was so deafening that one could hear a pin drop. No one on either side made a sound, while Qi Zuyan ruminated over Hua Xianji's words from where she was in the middle. The Ministry of Revenue reported on the harvest status in each region at the beginning of the year. Li Jianting, who had never interjected before in Mingli Hall, suddenly spoke up out of the blue. If Juexi is unable to bear the burden, we can consolidate with the granaries of the other prefectures to make up for the shortfall. The Empress Dowager rebutted, the heir apparent doesn't manage court affairs and so does not know the ins and outs of the matter. He province already had its turn last year, and they still have to supply grains to Chu capital with Juexi this year. The various regions are all in a difficult position. In their exchange, they serendipitously avoided bringing up the 8 cities. Qi Zuyan had a sudden flash of insight. The 8 cities surrounded Chu capital. Were they not Chu capital's splendor before the stairs? Hua Xianji spoke of not getting a clear look. What was it that one could not get a clear look at? The detailed data of the 8 cities' harvests. Since the Dan city field taxes could be falsified, then how many of the remaining cities' field taxes were even genuine? The fields were not even thoroughly surveyed, and there were plenty that could be concealed within. Hua Xianji's final words mentioned those with empty stomachs. There were countless refugees from Dan city last year, all of whom had fled with their stomachs empty. Pan Yi clearly knew he would not be able to hide this fact, so why did he not set up booths immediately to hand out porridge to the poor? Sweat was already trickling down Qi Zuyan's temples in just those few brief moments, and she inwardly exclaimed, "What a close call!" *******. The rattan chair rocked slightly, with folds of meandering snow-white sleeves lying on the knees in it. Shenzhequan opened his folding fan to block out some of the sunlight. Yao Wenyu was still tidying up some old books on the table. It was all quiet in the courtyard. Shenzhequan looked at the mottled plum blossoms leaves above his head in tandem with the rocking. The dappled light fell upon him, and he reached out with his folding fan to catch it and hold it before his eyes to scrutinize it. Yao Wenyu flipped to a stack of cases amidst the old books. He opened it and saw that it was Cha province's earliest grain records. He had seen this previously, but by some curious coincidence this time, he flipped to the back page, then turned his wheelchair around to speak to Shenzhequan, who was by the door. The exorbitantly priced grains of Cha province for the past years have been grains from He province, but last year, He province even had to bear the burden for both the military provisions and Chu capital's granaries. As I see it, the goods being transported and traded in this account book are all large shipments. Suppose Yan Hiru still has to shoulder the grains for the bandits of Mount Luo, then even if He province enjoys a bountiful harvest every year, he slowly straightened out the account book. It should be just about empty by now. I initially suspected that Yan Hiru stole the grains from Juexi and He province to sell. But when Fan province's account was released, I realized that the granaries of these two places had no surplus grains left for him to trade. Liang Qiushan started to take charge of all affairs pertaining to taxes in Juexi and He province last year. Yan Hiru said the last time that he did not manage to get through to Liang Qiushan. Holding onto the door frame for support, Yao Wenyu's expression shifted slightly. Then where did the grains he sold last year come from? Shenzhequan turned his head and locked eyes with Yao Wenyu for a moment. The granaries of the 8 cities. The grains Yan Hiru resold last year to the various prefectures in Zongbo came from the 8 cities. Yao Wenyu swiftly flipped through the book in his lap. The exorbitantly priced grains in Fan province and Deng province were sold through Chai Yu's hands. Your lordship killed Chai Yu, and Yan Hiru did not tell the truth. The folding fan in Shenzhequan's palm suddenly closed. He was still leaning back, gazing at the sunlight. Enlightened in that instant, he said, that means the Empress Dowager did not have enough in reserves to shoulder Kedong's military provisions. She was making empty promises. This bluff of a move completely had Shueziao's Woe trapped. The 8 cities' accounts were too corrupted. Even Pan Lin himself would not necessarily know which were genuine and which were forged. The Dan city fields that Shueziao's Woe investigated were indeed off, and the harvest data that Pan Yi had handed over to the Ministry of Revenue at the earliest was fake, too. However, the grain surplus that the noble clans had submitted was real. They misappropriated the commoners' fields, and yet they did not have grains, because the grains had been rerouted over on the sly to Yanhiru to resell at a profit. The 8 cities' granaries had always been empty. Hua Hui, Shenzhequan laughed aloud, unable to refrain from marveling with a sigh, what an outstanding of the Empress Dowager. If Shuiziaozuo were forced to drop his investigation into the Dan city fields due to the requisition of military provisions and take a step back to express goodwill to the Empress Dowager, then by the time he was done doing it, he would realize that the Empress Dowager had no grains at all, and Qidong could still not mobilize their troops. When the time comes, Shuiziaozuo would not only lose his current advantage but also bear the risk of a revolt from the Imperial Academy. He would even find himself doubted and being called into question by the proactive faction. Hua Hui was not an official of the imperial court. She had her own way of playing amongst this group of shrewd and astute men. End chapter.